to Matthew, who's got some great information to share with us. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to you all today and talk to you about misinformation and the social science side of it. So I have some slides to cover some of my research on the subject, um, and then I'll dive into Q&A. Okay, so I take the social psychological position on misinformation, and that's what I'll be covering today about why people believe misinformation and then what we can do about it. So first, I'll be talking about some factors involved in misinformation and polarization, namely identities and social networks. And then I'll be talking about what can help reduce our vulnerability to misinformation and polarization, how we can potentially counter these identity biases by through a few different methods. And then I also want to cover how we can rebuild trust in science and institutions, because I think that's another critical component. And finally, I will end with a discussion of media and digital literacy as well. And then hopefully lots of time for questions at the end. So before I start talking about how identities impact misinformation, I wanted to just provide an overview of how social psychologists define identities, because I think it's really important. So we think of identities as a set of meanings that defines individuals in terms of the roles they occupy, social categories they belong to, or individual characteristics. So you can be a student and have a student identity where you go to class and do your homework and study. Or maybe you belong to a sports team and that's maybe more of a social category you belong to. Or maybe you think of yourself as a skeptical, curious person, and that's an individual characteristic that defines you as a unique person. So our identities influence a lot of our beliefs and behaviors because we're motivated to protect our identities because they give us a sense of self-esteem. And this is called identity verification. And basically, it provides a self-esteem boost whenever we act in a way that is consistent with the meanings of those identities. So again, if we're a student and we get a good grade on our test, that's great. It makes us feel good. If we join a sports team and we score a game-winning goal, again, makes us feel good. Or if we're a skeptical, curious person and we learn something new, that also gives us that self-esteem boost. So, and a lot of times, identities help us navigate our social worlds and provide us with meaning, self-esteem. They do a lot of good things. And we want to support the identities that are important to us. But sometimes, whenever we have identities, such as political identities, this can conflict with processing the world in an evidence-based way. So, when I define misinformation, I'm just broadly referring to false or misleading information. And our political identities can then bias us to support our own in-group and sometimes attack our out-group. And I'll be focusing on the United States today, since we live in the United States. I think most of us are from here on this call. But from a social science perspective, the United States is actually very interesting because it provides such a clear in-group and out-group that allows us to study polarization and susceptibility to misinformation among two clearly defined groups. But importantly, these identity processes that I'm talking about apply to identities more broadly. You've probably seen charts like this over time where we see this growing political polarization in the United States. And this has been happening for the last several decades. And it's not just ideological polarization. We're seeing this really strong dislike of political outgroups. So you can see this graph of the last few decades. We're seeing this very decrease of how warm we feel towards the opposing political group. And this has real world implications. As we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, right from the beginning, we saw Democrats and Republicans process the severity of the virus very differently. And this maintained throughout the pandemic, even as we learn more about the virus. This also spilled over into attitudes towards vaccines. We saw a very partisan divide with the COVID-19 vaccine, and now have seen it with vaccines more generally. And one of the few things that Republicans and Democrats can agree on today is actually that they cannot agree on basic facts. And again, this is because of how polarized our country is in many different ways. So beyond just thinking about identities and polarization in a concrete in-group, out-group dynamic, I think it's also important to really think about how these political identities intersect with other identities, and that provides a much broader view of how we process information. So one way to think about this is through this term of social identity complexity. And this just means whenever you have many important identities that are independent from each other, that means you have more social identity complexity. And research has shown that people who have higher social identity complexity tend to be more open-minded, more tolerant of outgroups. And whenever people have more intergroup contact, this also connects to a higher social identity complexity. So the opposite of this is lower social identity complexity is whenever you have these identities that share a bunch of overlap and share a bunch of meanings and values. And this can create uh, vulnerability to misinformation and bias from this narrow lens of identities. And we also know that identities become more important to us when they share identities, when they share meanings with other identities. So this is a reinforcement cycle that can take place as well. So we can think about American polarization as linked to low social identity complexity, where many Americans have these mega identities that so much of their identity is tied up to just a few central identities that strongly overlap with each other. And there's been research thinking about how if people can reflect on this and broaden their set of identities, it can actually reduce polarization. And I take this frame in regards to misinformation and susceptibility to misinformation. So to give you an example of this, let's say we have someone who has low social identity complexity. They have a religious identity and a political identity. It doesn't really matter what they are, but let's just pretend they share 100% overlap and their values from their religion and the values from their politics completely overline and there's no disconnect. And then beyond that, let's say they volunteer at their place of worship and all of their friends are in the same location as well. So you see that all of these identities completely overlap. There's no conflict, and they're constantly reinforcing each other and creating more and more shared meanings, which makes them more important for the person. So all of their self-esteem is tied up to this narrow lens of identities and the meanings associated with them. So any attack on one of these meanings feels like a very strong personal attack because so much of their self-esteem is wrapped up in this narrow set of identities. Conversely, if we have higher social identity complexity, we can have political and religious identities, but let's say they don't really overlap very much. Let's say we volunteer, but we don't volunteer at our church. We volunteer at a pet shelter or something completely apolitical. And we have friends that are involved in groups that are very different than our politics and religion. This provides a much broader social identity complexity and allows us to derive self-esteem from a variety of sources. So any piece of information that challenges us or any attack on any single identity doesn't feel that threatening because we can rely on self-esteem from such a broad range of identities with their broad range of meanings. So when we think about in terms of political polarization and misinformation, we have seen throughout a variety of studies that both Democrats and Republicans are motivated to process information in a way that affirms their identities. But we also have shown through some of my research that whenever people have, especially they think that their political identity is especially important to them, this actually predicts an even higher vulnerability to political bias when evaluating misinformation. And these identities that can bias us also intersect with the surrounding networks people find themselves in. So it's also important to think about how these identities then intersect with social networks. So in social science, there's this term homophily, which just means we prefer to associate with people who are similar to us. So, understandably, Democrats and Republicans tend to have politically homogeneous social media networks. So, are some graphs of a typical Facebook profile of a liberal and a conservative, where the red dots are other conservative friends and the blue dots are other liberal friends. And you can probably guess which one is your typical liberal Facebook profile versus conservative Facebook profile. What happens whenever we associate with so many people who share our identities is that they create this feedback loop with this mutual identity verification. So you share something on Facebook that affirms your identity, and then your Facebook friend sees that, likes it, and shares it, and you're constantly being rewarded in this mutually reinforcing spiral. And this can actually strengthen your beliefs and create more polarization and more susceptibility to misinformation. But the type of relationship does matter. So, shared agreement among our personal networks can bolster different beliefs, but just superficial exposure to the outgroup won't reduce the beliefs. So, there's actually research showing on Twitter that when people had some exposure to an outgroup, like a politician or some public figure, it didn't make them less polarized. That actually could increase polarization because it's not a very meaningful social interaction. But closeness of ties that is relevant for this process because if you have people who think differently than you in your close personal network, that can actually reduce polarization or at least has this link that can predict lower polarized attitudes. So some of my research dove into this, and I did find that greater shared agreement in one's network predicted stronger identity importance, political identity importance. And then people who had these stronger identity importance also were more likely to be vulnerable to believing misinformation in the form of political rumors and fake news headlines that affirmed their particular political identity. I also looked at vaccine attitudes, and I found that greater proportion of Democrats in one network predicted greater support for vaccines, both the COVID-19 vaccine and vaccines more general. And the opposite effect was true for Republicans. So far, I've been talking about misinformation very broadly, looking at like false news headlines or political rumors. But disinformation just means purposely misleading someone or sharing false information. And I just wanted to briefly touch on this because disinformation can take advantage of identity and network biases. If someone's trying to manipulate us, they can try to understand what we have this motivation to protect in regards to our identity and then provide us with information that affirms it. But more broadly, disinformation can actually just sow confusion and undermine trust in information and institutions. So there's also some research suggesting that individuals who lack status or social support are especially vulnerable to extremism and propaganda. And this takes a broader view of how if people do not have a lot of a diverse set of social identities, a diverse set of social support, they may latch on to a very narrow lens of identities, social support, which makes them more vulnerable to extremism and propaganda. So, in summary, identities are this very powerful social psychological force, and they can do a lot of great things. They provide us with self-esteem, provide us a lot of meaning for us. But when we have this strong motivation to protect them, we also are vulnerable to believing false information when we're so dependent on protecting our identities, especially if our identities share a lot of overlap and we are especially motivated to protect the meanings of that narrow lens of identities. Networks can reinforce this and create additional bias. So, diversity within networks can help, and it can help reduce susceptibility to misinformation as we talk to more people who think differently than us. And if we want to improve dialogue, one way to do it is connecting via a shared identity outside of politics. But this can be difficult for many reasons. I can talk more about this. But one reason is just if your political identity is connected to another identity that's being attacked directly. So, one study I did a few years ago found that people who are LGBTQ are more likely to stop talking to someone with different politics than their cisgender heterosexual counterparts. So, this could be that if your personal identity is under attack, you may not want to associate with someone who has different politics than you because it creates another barrier. So these social factors are really important when I think about identities and networks and how we process information. But I also think they're critical for thinking about trust and rebuilding trust, which is also another important component for misinformation. So I wanted to briefly talk about the social elements of trust and what that means. So it's important to think about trust as a social concept and the social concepts that uh, contribute to trustworthiness. And there's research showing that trust in science actually can be evaluated by perceived competence and warmth. So it's not just if you think the scientist is competent, but do you think they have your best interests in mind? So building trust through social relationships is key. And not only do you have to be considered likable and warm and having your best interests in mind, but there's also research showing that scientists who acknowledge uncertainty are rated more trustworthy as well. So if you have a very confident claim about something when the data is still coming out, and then you end up being wrong about something, that can reduce trustworthiness. So the social elements are really important for why someone listens to one person or another and the distance psychologically between the person is a critical factor. So you can think about a TikTok influencer who's on your phone every day and you feel like you have this parasocial relationship with them. If they're giving you health advice, you might trust them, even though they don't have the credentials as a medical doctor or a medical institution, but you have this very strong social relationship with them that builds trustworthiness. And then you can contrast that to if you don't know any scientists or doctors in your personal life, and you just think of science as an institution, some faceless abstract group, then you may be less likely to trust that group because you don't have that social connection with them. So this speaks to the strong value of science communication and actually working with people and connecting with them. So there's research showing how scientists could be more active on social media and even think of themselves as like a nerd of trust because they already have the personal connections in their networks and being able to share their expertise with people who already has that social component with them can be very beneficial. And another study that I worked on with a bunch of people. This was like over 200 people worked on this global study, 68 countries. We looked at trust in scientists. And one of the really positive findings was throughout these countries, 83% of people overall wanted to hear scientists communicate more about their findings. So there is a need for this. People do want to hear from scientists, and we can definitely do a better job of going and sharing our work and especially connecting science and communities. So it's not just to share your research on social media, although it's important. I think if we want to work with people, we should try to connect to them. And one way to do this could be to connect via shared identity, shared community. Climate scientist Dr. Catherine Ao does this with climate change. So she's an evangelical Christian, and she often talks to faith-based groups about climate change. Dr. Rashawn Ray is a sociologist. He has looked at how public health officials could set up COVID-19 and vaccination sites and local community groups and pillars such as churches and barber shops. And there's been research showing that whenever people participate in citizen science activities, such as measuring air quality, it actually increases their trust in science more broadly, as well as their local institutions. So it reduces that psychological distance that I spoke of before. So that's a quick overview of a lot of these social factors that contribute to information processing. The last thing I wanted to cover was how education is another way that can help. And specifically, I'll be talking about media literacy. And this is a broad umbrella term that covers a lot of things that you see on this screen here as far as how we can think about evaluating content online. And broadly, it can be defined as how we critically evaluate media and information, such as verifying credibility, identifying manipulation techniques, but also reflecting on our own biases. And this is important because we know that people with higher media literacy actually are better at discerning true versus false headlines online. But most people tend to believe they are better at detecting fake news and they have better media literacies than their accuracy scores indicate. So, one example of media literacy that helps people more credibly evaluate information is what's called lateral reading, which means instead of looking vertically within an article you see online, you look laterally and check across different domains, such as checking the potential biases of the author who wrote the article or the reliability of the media outlet and if there's specific funding, financial incentives that might bias this media outlet. So you're thinking more broadly about media instead of just within the actual article itself. So we know that we can improve media literacy when we get people to take classes, but this is very resource intensive. So not everyone can sit through an 8-week course. So, researchers have been developing these quick online pre-bunking games that are a scalable way to teach people how to identify misinformation techniques and also improve their media literacy. So, instead of debunking claims after the fact, the goal is to empower people with the skills to identify misinformation techniques and how to identify credible information before they're exposed to it. And there's a lot of examples of this. One classic game now is called the bad news game, where you try to get as many online followers as you can by spreading false information. So you learn about trolling and polarization and how emotion can get more people to click on your information. Another one is Harmony Square that focuses more on a political angle. And again, you're trying to sow discord and chaos in this Harmony Square town. So you learn about different techniques by being the person that spreads disinformation. And more recently, we've seen how AI chatbots can also help debunk conspiracy theories because people who have a certain conspiracy theory will interact with a chatbot that will poke out holes in their logic and their reasoning. And one study found that people who had this dialogue with a chatbot actually reduced their belief in their chosen conspiracy by about 20% of how confident they were. We developed a pre-bunking game ourselves. It was called Galifacta. It was designed for an Indonesian audience, and Galifacta broadly means fact game. And basically, so many of these games, these media literacy games, focus on Western English-speaking populations, and we wanted to try to design one for Indonesia, which is the fourth largest country in the world. So our game also takes a slightly different spin on media literacy games. Um, the goal is to protect your family from hoaxes and misinformation, and you're involved in this WhatsApp style chat. So your friend or family will send you some rumor they found online. Here's an example of them being afraid of this tiger running around Jakarta, and you can click on what they sent you and look how credible it is. And when you click on this article, it doesn't look like it's very reputable. So then you can say, no, I don't think this is reputable. I don't think it's true. And you get badges learning about how to look for official sources and not rumors. So we wanted to test if this game actually helped people identify false headlines more accurately. So we had Indonesian participants play our Galifacta game in one condition, and the other condition, they played Tetris as a control group. Then they evaluated these headlines that were circulating Indonesian social media at the time. And we did find that people who played our game were significantly more likely to identify false information. They were more skeptical of false information and less likely to share it. Importantly, they did not have more skepticism for factual headlines. So it only increased their skepticism for false headlines, things that were completely not true. Most recently, we've been looking at how our game could compare to other games. So we made an English version of Galifacta, and we tested our game with Harmony Square and made an Indonesian version of that. And we had people do a similar thing where they saw one of the games or Tetris. So there was three total groups, and we had an American sample, an Indonesian sample, and we had them evaluate both factual and false headlines. And we found some pretty encouraging results again. So even in a different set of headlines, we again replicated that Galifacta improved sharing discernment. So they are more likely to share true headlines as opposed to false headlines. Interestingly, Harmony Square in the Indonesian sample had no effect and was rated as less engaging compared to Kali Fakta. In our American sample, both games worked pretty well and both improved sharing and accuracy discernment for true and false headlines. And then most recently, I've been looking at AI and digital literacy. In this recent study, we tried to teach people how to identify manipulated images. So in one condition, they just saw a bunch of AI deepfakes and were just asked if it was a real image or an altered image. And then the other conditions, they got feedback on pointing out if something was manipulated or not. And they also got brief education to try to help them identify these manipulation techniques. And we also found that people who were in these education or feedback conditions were significantly more likely to be able to identify manipulated images. So, just with these brief tools, we can actually improve people's media and digital literacy. So, in conclusion, why do people believe and share misinformation? From a social psychological perspective, a lot of this motivation to protect important identities and affirm those identities through ideological congruent networks creates this vulnerability for misinformation. So, when we think about how we protect people against misinformation, it's important to address these social factors, promote media literacy, and also try to rebuild trust in science and institutions. And this connects to my forthcoming book, Misguided. It's coming out this July, and it covers a lot about what I talked about today. So I dive into what is misinformation, how do we define it, how do we study it as social scientists, and then I spend the next chapter really diving into how our identities make us vulnerable to misinformation. So I touched on that in this talk, but I really dive into the nuances of how identities work, how they intersect with other identities, and how we can learn about them to protect ourselves from false information and bias. Then I focus on political identities and the response to COVID-19 as a case study. And I end that chapter with a discussion on how to have productive conversations with people who think differently than us. The goal isn't to change minds, it's just to present our perspective in a way that increases it at least being heard by the other person. And then I talk about social networks and social media and their influence in misinformation. So again, I touched on how social networks can amplify our susceptibility to misinformation, but social media has a really complex relationship with our beliefs and misinformation. So I spent a lot of time diving into the research for that. The next chapter talks about vaccine misinformation as a case study, and then also connects it a lot to social media and the misinformation about vaccines on social media. And I end that chapter with a discussion on how we can rebuild trust in institutions. So I talked about how we can do that on a social psychological level with the social factors of trust, but I also talk about community level and institution level guidelines as well. Finally, towards the end of the book, I talk about education, media literacy, and pre-bunking, and really dive into that research, what the cutting edge research on media literacy looks like, and how it can be increased in scale through pre-bunking games and other measures. And finally, at the end of the book, I talk about what I think could be some of the most important things for the future of misinformation, specifically looking at artificial intelligence, both as a way to help protect ourselves against misinformation, but also the vulnerabilities that artificial intelligence could create for the spread of misinformation. So, thank you all so much for listening to my talk. I am active on Threads and Blue Sky mostly. There's my email if you have any questions. My website has all of my articles and research on there. I also have a newsletter and podcast through my Substack and on different podcast platforms. It's also just called Misguided the podcast and Misguided the newsletter. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have if you find me on there. But hopefully we have time for some questions as well. So yeah, my book is officially available for pre-order. There's the Columbia Press website. But it's also on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and stuff like that. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much again for being with us. So again, as a reminder, go ahead and start dropping some of your questions in the chat box. In the meantime, I know I saw some come through already in the chat. So I can go ahead and facilitate those questions. So the first one I think we had was from Jared. So it says, seems as if the epidemic of low self-esteem, particularly in men, is driving a lot of this behavior around misinformation. Do you find that to be accurate based on your research?
So that speaks to, I think, the loneliness crisis. And I think that's definitely a huge component. So I touched on it a little bit with the some of the research about the vulnerability of people who feel like they have less social status, are more vulnerable to extremism and propaganda. And it's a really big issue because you can think about the psychological component of it, but I also think about like our structural side of it. So the how our society is structured, we don't have a lot of opportunities for people to meet other people in a lot of different spaces. So this is often referred to the lack of third spaces in American society, where a lot of people go to work and they come home, but there's not like a third space where they can find community and find social support with a diverse group of people. So it'd be great if there's more opportunities for that. And there was more opportunities for men in particular to find other men or other people to give them social support so they're not so vulnerable to having all of their self-esteem be dependent on this narrow lens of online content or online influencers that provide them with a sense of self-esteem and meaning.
Great. So the next question coming in. From Patrick. So seems like this is more of a statement, but maybe you can address this as well. Churches are particularly skilled at creating and reinforcing an internal social support system and can then force acceptance of fringe thought like young earth creationism,
Mhm.
inferiority of women, etc.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, churches do a great job of providing that social component. Again, it's really critical. Like when you think about religion, there's the ideological component, of course, but then what churches do is they provide this sense of community, and they provide so you meet a lot of your friends and potential partners at that particular space. So it reinforces that. And the big thing is like if you grow up in the church and you make a lot of friends in the church and your family's in the church, then if you become an atheist, then not only is that a challenge from your belief system, but you risk losing a lot of your community and that social support. So that's a huge role on why people stick with the particular beliefs they have is when they have that social support system.
Okay, then we have a question here from Walter. I find the major problem with legacy media is that what they say is what they say is true, but they leave out important alternatives. So maybe like cherry pick narrative here. Do you find this to be important?
Yeah, definitely. Legacy media has made plenty of mistakes throughout history, and yeah, it provides a space for alternative media to pop up that may or may not be more reputable. Um, and really, I mean, you could argue legacy media has presented the most misinformation just at scale because it's had such wide audiences. So even if it's slightly misleading, um, that's still a form of misinformation and can reach a bunch of people to have a biased perspective on a particular event. So. It's a big challenge because they also do some really great work as well and provide a lot of critical fact checking and reporting. So it's a challenge. And then that also speaks to the broader incentive structure of news organizations and media where they're incentivized to get clicks and get people's attention so that maybe not always be creating an environment for the most nuance and accuracy.
Great. And then I see more of a thought here in the chat. I don't think it was really necessarily a question, but something I'm interested in. We have Jared here saying, can we get books and symposiums like this to be required in junior high, please, for the children? Do you know of anything, Matthew, that's being done, at an elementary or, middle, high, K through 12, I should say, level to address this?
There are some initiatives. I know there's some state bills trying to add media and digital literacy and AI literacy to curriculums, and I think that's really important. Definitely a big component of it. So I think it's a good thing. There's some movement on it. There's some organizations that care about media literacy. Um, but there's not enough funding for it. So, I wish there was more funding, more support for this. It's such a small slice of what it needs to be. And I think reaching students is really important, but also older adults, I think, is another important area too. So it's a challenge to reach all of these diverse audiences and diverse groups of people, and trying to create content that resonates with them as well is also important.
Any more questions? Drop in the chat box or the Q&A. Oh, we've got one here. What reasons are there to be hopeful that we will overcome the polarization, misinformation, and disinformation in our country?
Um, I think there is some reasons to be hopeful. So I was just at this media summit in Boston, and one of the parts of it that made me feeling most hopeful was actually seeing the wave of young content creators who cover the news in an accurate and engaging way. So I think a lot of young people, especially, have a better understanding of our current information environment in a way that can stay both accurate and engaging. And I think that's really a critical component of addressing this. So we think about like the crisis of trust in our media institutions. I think that in the future, these institutions are slowly going to adapt, and there's going to be more content creators and independent media that can fill that gap in a way that can hopefully provide credible information to a large audience. So, um, the younger generation gives me hope.
And any specific recs for our audience? Any recommendations?
Let's see. Let's see. I have a list of them. I could pull them up. Um, what is that guy's name? Yeah, there's a whole panel of people who spoke at this. I was trying to see if I can find it was the GBH Media Summit is where I was recently. Um, it's like the Boston's like PBS and Nova, and they had this really great event where they invited a lot of people in legacy media as well as content creators. So I'll send that in the chat. And if you look at yeah, engaging younger generations, basically everybody on that list. So that's why I was trying to think of like one person. They're all very good. So I think those are some good recommendations.
See your statement there, Walter, about big money in politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue. Economics are a big part of this, and that's always a big challenge. It's like, we're a lot of science communicators and people who care about media and digital literacy are just barely scraping by for funding. Whereas if you lie to people, it's much easier to get a lot of money if you just tell people what they want to hear. So that's an uncomfortable truth, but it's an important point.
Another question, a few questions coming in. Um, what can be done to encourage scientists to step forward and do whatever they can to educate the population?
Yeah, so I think changing the incentive structure in academia is one way. So academia, like many institutions, are very slow to change, slow to adapt. And it used to be the case, and it still is the case for a lot of places where you're not really rewarded for doing any sort of science outreach. And sometimes you're penalized. It's like, why are you spending time engaging with your community where you could be writing more papers or writing grants or something? And very slowly, there's more institutions that are finally adapting to this. So at the University of Notre Dame, we actually have a professorship of science communication. I think it's one of the first ones in the country, where part of the actual professor's job is engaging with the public and doing a podcast and doing a bunch of talks. And that's part of their like tenure package. So instead of just going up for promotion where you're only looking at your research publications, if universities could reward scientists for engagement, and that's part of their tenure and promotion file, I think that'd be really helpful as well.
Another one here. What will happen with information disorder in an increasingly fragmented information environment? Will it get better or worse if we're all federated slash protocoled?
Um, I mean, that's my worry is that information is going to be more fragmented, more personalized. And, with AI, it's so easy. Like you can log in and, the very dystopian view is, you put on, some kind of gear and you're just in a completely different reality. Um, and that's what I worry is that we're going to be more and more separated in the information we get, the people we associate with. And again, the way to counter that is actually getting people together, and that's really the challenge. It's a simple solution, but it's still so challenging to actually do that in practice. So I hope we don't become more disconnected as technology evolves. I hope technology can help us become connected, but we'll see. We'll see how that happens.
Let's see, another question here. What part of your research or the research you found for your book surprised you the most? What seemed the most unintuitive?
Yeah, I mean, I think really the strength of these social factors is always surprising to me. I mean, there's all these studies that show that even highly educated people, even people with strong media literacy skills, can still be vulnerable to misinformation. And it gets to the point where you can actually trick people. There's this one study where they had, I think it was Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump supporters. They had them fill out a survey about how they felt about each candidate. And then at the end, they actually switched some of their answers. So, like Hillary Clinton supporters would see an answer that they didn't give about Donald Trump, saying that they thought he was good about economics, for example. And in their mind, they would still justify it of like, oh, maybe I said that because Trump was a businessman or something. And it really speaks to these cognitive and social factors that influence how we process information and just how strong they are and how we view our worlds. So I think education is such a critical component of it, but unless we get to the root of these social vulnerabilities, there's always going to be strong susceptibility to misinformation. So it seems intuitive, or it seems potentially not intuitive that, we're making these decisions based on so many social factors when we'd like to believe we're very rational thinking people, and we are, but sometimes it's very rational to support our social groups, and that can bias us in many different ways.
Okay, I see some stuff going on in the chat. They're talking about the news media again, particularly what is known as sane washing. So, if you think of legacy media has been very guilty of going easy on elected officials. An example is not reporting enough about how Biden was shielded from the media
Mm.
on protecting his declining physical and or mental health, but also translating or sane washing. Uh, you know, Donald Trump's quotes versus his actual statements. That seems like something folks are really interested in talking about. Can you speak to that as uh, as is there a solution to that?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a problem. Um, the solution again is tricky because you're talking about these strong like economic forces that motivate people. They might want access to power. And, if you criticize the president, President Biden or President Trump, you might not get access to them for an interview in the future. So I don't know what a good solution to that is. I think the more concentrated power we have, the more vulnerable we are as a society. So I don't know. That's more of a political science question. I wonder about that too.
Um, and then I guess this seems like more of a personal question, but if you feel comfortable, Dan wants to know, has a MAGA voter ever changed your mind about anything?
Um, I actually attended this workshop through the Braver Angels group. So Braver Angels is like a nonprofit focused on depolarization, where you meet lots of different people with different political perspectives. Um, and yeah, I've talked to a bunch of people of different politics than I do. Um, I guess I was more open to the learning about the inefficiencies of government. I think that's something that I didn't realize as much. And talking to some voters who felt very strongly about that were able to present information to me that I wasn't aware of before and kind of changed my mind about it a little bit. So yeah, I think one of the best things about talking with people that think differently than you is one, they expose you to things you might not know about, but two, they really force you to think more critically on your own beliefs and your own biases. I think that's one of the big benefits is like really providing an opportunity to be more thoughtful and more nuanced in your position. It doesn't mean necessarily you change your mind or you change your values, but you're more thoughtful about your argument. And it's not maybe such a binary of something being 100% this way or that way, but there's some shades of gray that you might have not have considered before.
And then I get this question is something I'm more interested in, and I'm sure maybe some of the students here as well. If you're obviously still engaged with the campus community there at Notre Dame, but maybe if you could, if you were an undergraduate student, for instance, right now, and you had a bunch of extra time, what would what sort of action would you be taking on campus to address this issue? Or is it already being addressed? On a structural sort of institutional level in higher education?
Um, that's a good question. So I guess depending on what your goals are, like if your goals are to work within the campus community, I mean, there's groups like Secular Student Alliance and campus groups that you can work with to promote critical thinking and skepticism of a wide range of issues, advocating for courses on media literacy, AI literacy, how people process information. I mean, that's one way. I mean, colleges are businesses and like you courses, if students sign up for them, that's how they exist. So if you advocate for more courses on these topics and you actually sign up to attend those courses, that will ensure that they'll be on the campus in the future. Um, so yeah, that's one thing I would do. And then yeah, depending on, if you want to stay in this space, there's lots of groups. I think that, as I mentioned before, the power of community is something that's really critical. So, finding your group of people that are aligned with you on whatever topic you're interested in, and then networking with them and working towards a common goal is definitely how you'd have the most change.
And then on a personal level again, I'm from Florida. I have like just a lot of friends and family. I always tell my friends it's often a privilege to distance yourself
Mhm.
from the MAGA wing of politics. There's a lot of us who come from spaces where we'd be distancing ourselves from everyone in our lives.
Mhm. Right.
And I'd say generally I have a pretty good relationship with many friends and family back home. And so I have that trust there, right? But I find it very hard to enter into conversations, about information, say, during COVID, for example.
Mhm.
I find that, entering conversations, about their information versus mine oftentimes sort of sows a divide rather than the trust that you spoke of being like a unifying force where we could, get together and at least have a conversation or, you're at least open to having your mind changed. Is there, any research that is being done into how to navigate those conversations or the best sort of space, or is there a solution that you've read into that you know about to navigate some of those uh, Thanksgiving
Mhm.
conversations, Thanksgiving table conversations?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's definitely research on this, and I've spoken about it before. I actually did give a talk on like how to have productive Thanksgiving conversations.
Wow.
Um, And some of it is kind of related to what I talked about before, as far as like connecting with something outside of politics is really important. So some shared identity, some shared interest, that kind of turns down the heat before you get into the politics. And talk about how you have shared goals. Like our community, we care about keeping our community safe. And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? And then you can kind of start from a place of mutual interest and go from there. And then there's a lot of research and work on how to have like productive conversations with like the actual words you use and the active listening techniques that you use. I found some really small things like asking people how they came to a conclusion and how they know something is true is more productive than asking why. Sometimes when you ask why, it kind of presents this way of just saying, well, it's true because Trump said it or Biden said it, and it's not as it doesn't force them to do this like step-by-step mechanism approach. So even just like the words you use and the questions you use can facilitate more productive dialogue. But I think, more broadly, it's just it'd be great if people get more practice at this. And I think that's one of the big challenges is, you mentioned being from Florida, like you're in this environment where you're getting more practice with talking with people who think differently than you. I lived in South Carolina for a while and Tennessee for a while. So I definitely met a lot of people who think differently than me. And I worked with them on, some common goals, which was very helpful. So there are ways to do it. I talk about them in my book, and there's different organizations that focus on this as well. Constructive Dialogue Institute is another group of people that like focus on the science of constructive dialogue. So yeah, definitely resources available.
All right. Well, speaking of resources, Matthew, if you want to send me any resources to send out to participants in today's webinar, I'd be happy to do that. I dropped some of the links you mentioned earlier in the chat box, and I will drop that link to your book and to your website, Substack. But please send me any additional resources that you may want folks to take a look at when it comes to your body of research. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And I think at the peak we had over 60 folks here at this
Oh wow.
webinar. So super super exciting stuff that our crew is interested in hearing about this. And yeah, excited to continue the conversation and hopefully have you back someday.
Yeah, for sure. Be happy to come back. And yeah, thank you so much for the invite. It was great talking to all of you, and thank you all for your thoughtful questions.
Dokie. Well, thank you all, everyone, and you all have a good evening.
All right, thank you. Take
Mhm.
care. Bye bye.
Bye.